Cool. All right, let's do it. So what's up, everyone? My name's Connor O'Day. I work at Gitcoin. I do a lot of our grant operations, BD, partnership stuff, kind of DAO native, all types of work. But yeah, GM, I appreciate you guys showing up. The 9:30 a.m. talk on the last day of the conference I knew would be pretty rough, but I appreciate you guys being here. So I'm going to be talking about quadratic funding and different applications for it, what Gitcoin is currently doing, and kind of the whole concept around public goods and how I think that's it's a term we should maybe move away from, and I will tell you why. But first, what is quadratic funding? Quadratic funding is basically the mathematically optimal way to fund public goods in a democratic community. And it was initially proposed kind of wholly in the context of public goods. If you see the paper by Vitalik, Glenn, and Zoe, it was called A Flexible Design for Funding Public Goods. And the quick version, it's basically a fork of quadratic voting. But in an example, if one grant gets $100 from one person, another grant gets $100 from 10 funders, another grant gets $10 from 10 funders, it should be. Traditional matching, both would get 100, but with QF, grant 1 gets $20 and grant 2 gets $180. And the benefit here is like the preferences of the many outweigh the preferences of the few. And W2F is a public good. So this is kind of like the traditional 2x2 breakdown of types of goods. A public good is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. And so that is clean air, infrastructure, privacy. And then things that are rivalrous, aka if I use some of it, there's not the same amount for you. It reduces the total amount. Or club goods where they could be excludable. And we really focus on public goods. If you're familiar with Gitcoin, that's kind of our whole theme, and we really hit that one home. I'm wearing my public goods are good hat now. You can get that on the Gitcoin store. But when you think about it, like things that we think of as public goods, like Ethereum and the internet and toll roads. Ethereum, for example, like it's certainly rivalrous to some extent. There's limited amount of block space. It costs money to use. The internet probably, yes, a public good. But you think about the Great Firewall and different ways that people are actually excluded from the internet. It's certainly debatable. And then toll roads. There's a certain amount of congestion that can happen when they get too busy. So it might make sense to charge for them. But then does that make it a business model? Because it's still kind of a public good. So there's still ways that things can serve the public, but have a business model, or not necessarily be fully non-excludable and non-rivalrous. And with that in mind, are we, Gitcoin, the Ethereum community, only using QF to fund public goods? Probably not. And if public goods are good, are non-public goods not good? And does that mean we're funding public bads? And I bring this up. I have some screenshots in here. I have no idea who runs this account, but I thought it was super funny. There's an evil Gitcoin Twitter that is focused on funding public bads, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I thought that was a fun little quirk. And so, as of late, I think there's been a lot more discussion happening over the classification of public goods and goods in general. And I'm not going to make an assertion or an attempt to make an assertion of what the best model is to follow, but I'm happy that there's discussion happening around this. For example, Carl tweeted out recently this kind of revised version that has anti-rivalrous goods in it, which could be like network goods that actually gain value as more people use it or use the network. Symbiotic goods, kind of a similar function, but they're non-excludable. And then this other one kind of flips the whole thing on its side, but it kind of brings up that there are semi-rivalrous goods and semi-excludable goods that kind of fit, between the typical boxes of like the 2x2. And so, as long as we accept that there are many more types of public-ish goods and that QF is a useful tool for all kinds of coordination, I think we can kind of, expand the thought process of what's actually valuable to be funded and where QF can be used. And so what I'm kind of getting to is it's a gradient, right? It's not just black and white. There's all types of different goods. And the recent paper by Glenn, Pooja, and Vitalik, which is 2 out of 3 of the initial quadratic funding paper authors. And the focus was not on quadratic funding or public goods. It was on soul-bound tokens, which I think stirred up a lot of debate. But they make the case a few times that there's a spectrum between being fully private and public, and that people have different preferences and are not always just fully selfishly or fully selflessly motivated. And one quote that I found was interesting is, networks with increasing returns are most efficient when treated nearly as a purely public nor purely private goods, but rather as partial and plural shared goods. And so, even the original authors of this paper are kind of, expanding the thought process around, what is a public good? What are these models good for funding? So coming back to kind of what Gitcoin is doing, one aspect of the quadratic funding rounds we're doing have been cause rounds. And these are, not necessarily Web3 native. We're trying to do things in the real world. And I think it's interesting because a lot of them, are public goods, but also aren't. And so, climate solutions, grants that are trying to prevent and create solutions for climate change probably is a global public good. But if you actually look at the breakdown of grants that were in that round, it's very focused on, North America, Europe, and there's a whole other side of the world that is kind of left out there. And I think we need to do a better job of, activating projects in all different continents and countries. But also thinking about, there's positive externalities to a lot of these projects that do, have an impact globally, but a lot of them are very focused in certain geographies. Longevity is a funny one, I think. There's a whole movement about, life extension and, people just don't want to die. And so the longevity research, I think, is a public good. However, it's probably more of a public good for the wealthy. I imagine most people won't be able to afford the life extension research stuff in our lifetime. But so, maybe it could be wealth dependent. The advocacy rounds we're doing are focused on, policy and lobbying, but pretty much mainly in the US, so maybe not a public good for everyone, or maybe there are, externalities to the US policy that influences things globally. Ukraine is an interesting one. I think supporting Ukrainians in the time of war was certainly a public good, but there's obviously different opinions on the different sides, and ending war is good for everyone, but it could be argued that it's more of a geographically focused public good. And then diversity and inclusion, I think is absolutely a public good, but again, I think we have to look at the breakdown of where these grants are coming from, because we do have kind of a bias for, the North America, Europe areas. And one grant that I thought was super funny that we had way too much debate about was Pizza DAO on the Gitcoin platform. They're a DAO that provides pizza, at conferences, at events. I ate their pizza at ETH Denver. And so the whole debate was whether pizza is a public good. And some people felt really strongly that it isn't. Not everyone is benefiting from the pizza. But it ultimately was decided that it would stay on the platform. And also ECC, this is kind of on the nose, but ECC has a grant. ECC is a nonprofit. All of the funds that were raised in the grant, went to running this event at cost. But, is it a public good? A lot of people can't afford to travel here. Maybe the funds are going towards food and drinks, and, it's a debate. But I bring these up not to say that we shouldn't fund them, but rather we need to reconsider the classifications of types of rounds and how we group them together. So we accept quadratic funding can more efficiently allocate capital, community preferences in many areas, not just strictly public goods. Then what's Gitcoin been up to? Because our whole tagline is fund public goods, and public goods are good. So taking a step back, we've now run 14 quarterly quadratic funding rounds. If you're not familiar, these last about 2 weeks. We do them typically in the last month of each quarter, and they've pretty much been growing round over round for the last 3 years. So the first year the matching pool was, our first quarter was 25K, and I think 38K was the total amount after community donations. And then the last few rounds, GR 12, 13, 14, all had about a $3 million matching pool, and anywhere from 2 to 3 million community contributions. So in total, I think it's $40 or $50 million that has been distributed to open source and public goods and semi-public goods via the Gitcoin platform. And we ran some experiments along the way. So the first few rounds, it was just one main pool. Everything was kind of grouped together. We then, after I think rounds 4 or 5, started to break it down into categories. So we had dApps, infrastructure. We did some experiments with geographies. So we had an East Asian round, We tried a few things, kind of what we're calling cause rounds now. During COVID, we had like a public health round and some other experiments like that. And then at one point, we actually moved back to having one main pool. So everything was grouped together again. And then that's kind of taken us to where we are now, where we have one main overall pool, but we've been breaking things out into specific ecosystem rounds and cause rounds. And these are different than the categories because they're not mutually exclusive. Previously, a grant would have to be in dApps or have to be in infrastructure. And now we kind of have this breakdown where a grant, depending on the theme and how it fits, can be in multiple rounds. So looking at GR14, like I said, I had $3.3 million total in matching. And we had $1 million main round, covered everything on the platform, $1 million for the cause rounds, climate, advocacy, and diversity. And then we had, I think, 14 ecosystem rounds. And so, some of these are kind of a single funder, like Polygon or Celo or ENS, like very focused on projects building on their protocol or their DAO. And then, some of them were more themed rounds. They were crowdfunded. So we had an ETH Infra round, we had a gaming round, we had a ZK Tech round. And those ones are usually, crowdfunded from a few different organizations. It's not like one DAO or one protocol funding, their own grants and their own ecosystem. So it's kind of been an interesting breakdown, and I think we could further delineate like the different types of rounds we're running. But what's interesting is, a grant could be in the climate round, could be in Polygon and main at the same time, if it's a fit and it fits the eligibility, and then kind of pull matching from all of those pools. And any donation to that grant, counts for the matching amount from all of them. So it's not like you need to donate to a grant in the context of one single round. And what we've also been trying out are some local rounds, which I think are like a whole nother area that haven't really been explored. Funny enough, actually, during the early COVID days, we did this downtown stimulus project, which was a bunch of small businesses in downtown Boulder kind of signed up to do this, more of a Web 2E QF round. And it was, I think you could use credit cards. It wasn't on the main Gitcoin platform, but that ended up raising a good, I want to say the pool was like 25K or even 50K, and I think there was, about $16,000 donated, no crypto involved at all. And then actually in the last grants round, we did an Oakland local round for different charities and like youth-focused restorative justice projects in Oakland, California. And so I think there were 7 grants in that. It kind of flew under the radar. It was kind of an experiment. But it was super interesting because maybe it's not as relevant to the whole global audience, but if we can activate people in specific communities, I think there's a lot more potential to experiment with local rounds, both certain cities, could be towns, could be smaller, or countries, states, like larger geographies. And that was like that wasn't open. That was kind of like a exclusive hand-selected round, and I think we'll see more of those happening as well. So what's next? So since Gitcoin has launched the DAO, we're essentially working to decentralize the grants platform and basically build a quadratic funding protocol that anybody can deploy to different chains, build their own front end, and most importantly, kind of customize and run their own self-serve rounds. Because right now, with the way Gitcoin is doing their quarterly rounds, everything is kind of grouped together. And so if someone wants to do their own round, they have to kind of do it on our cadence. Since the platform is pretty centralized as it stands, we need to help manage and run everything. But the goal of the protocol is that anyone can kind of plug in and use this at any time. And it doesn't have to be QF. It could be a different type of mechanism or grants program. And the key thing there is decentralized identity. That's a really hard problem to solve. But I think if you heard Kevin Iwaki's talk, he talked about the Gitcoin passport that we're working on. And I think we're getting to the point where we could reasonably have a decentralized identity system that we trust. But if we're not there, then doing a truly decentralized QF platform is pretty much impossible because Sybil attacks are the biggest threat that break down the whole mechanism. Further, we're going to be categorizing the rounds a bit more. As we grow and do all these different local and cause rounds, I think having one main overall pool is not as feasible. And so that will probably break down into something that's still very open, but maybe more targeted towards Ethereum or Web3. And like I kind of started off with, I think we need to reconsider, what public goods encompasses and, what it doesn't. And, kind of set the eligibility of these rounds around that and group them together based on the types of goods they are. And then, like I said, local rounds, cooperative rounds, private rounds, retroactive public goods funding, something we're doing with Optimism. We'll have an experiment with them soon on funding projects retroactively. And that I think actually is going to be a permissioned round where it's not open to anyone to donate, like they have with their DAO, different mechanisms for their community members to get involved. But so there'll be experiments that we're doing with Optimism. And then we're just trying to scale both horizontally and vertically. And by vertically, I just mean bigger pools, bigger rounds, more grants. But horizontally, trying experiments in new ways, different types of goods, different communities, different industries. And then thinking about independent versus codependent rounds. And so whether they overlap or whether they kind of run as a fully exclusive thing will be something we need to consider. Because right now they're all grouped together, but that's probably not feasible long term. And yeah, okay, I know I'm a bit over time. This is the last slide. But and then at that point, I think it's really important that we need some type of neutral protocol that's self-serve to try these experiments. But we could think about using QF for how a private university used its endowment. Or I haven't tried this one out. This one's kind of out there. But how a group of friends decide what restaurant to go to. Let me know if you do try that. I'm not sure if it's going to work. But country clubs, corporations prioritizing budget allocations, homeowners associations doing whatever they do, political parties, countries funding global initiatives, and government spending too. Like federally, I think people want more social services and less war. Better vibes, or local government spending. Like if you want to park in your neighborhood, people would donate to that. You could allocate some portion of funds. So I think we've sort of just scratched the surface for what we're doing with quadratic funding and public goods. And I think once there's a protocol that is basically permissionless, there'll be a lot more opportunity to experiment. And yeah, so that's my talk. Thank you guys for coming out. I know it's super early, but yeah, I'll be hanging around if you have any questions or want to chat. Thanks.